editing. It can be a hot topic in the indie community because unlike the traditional publishing model where the editor chooses the author, in indie publishing, the author chooses the editor, or not. As in, editors are expensive. Editing is a very time-consuming task. It requires a lot of deep thought, and it requires some specialty skills. You can hire your neighbor kid to mow your lawn, but you can't hire your neighbor kid to edit your book. So it makes sense that generally a good edit costs hundreds of dollars, and for a beginning author, you might not necessarily want to take the risk of hiring an editor for a book that might totally flop, or you might simply just not have the money at all. One of the trickiest things about indie publishing is that authors have to make the call for when their book is ready to be published and what level of editing it needs, which means that we are having to judge our own abilities, and this can be extremely difficult to do. We're usually not the best judge of our own abilities. I've seen a few people reference that I guess there was some kind of blow up, maybe on Threads. As discussed in a previous video, I'm not on Threads, but I guess there's been some conversation lately about indie authors who cannot afford or opt not to hire an editor. And I'm sure this is yet another thing, but that was probably provoked by the Audra Winter situation. But it's worth discussing in a broad sense. Is there ever a time when you should not hire an editor? How do you know? How do you deal with any of this? And if you absolutely cannot afford to hire an editor, should you still publish the book? Do you have the right to just throw your book out there without an edit, not being entirely sure whether it's good or bad? Let's talk about it. First, my name is Lydia Foxglove. If you're new here, I started out in traditional publishing. I sold my first book in 2008. To Bloomsbury, and I also had some books with Disney Hyperion. So I worked closely with 3 different editors, as well as had some input from a UK editor. I've had copy editors. I've worked with editors professionally, and in traditional publishing, when you sell a book, the editor is deciding whether they want to work with an author. And when you get your editorial letter back, it's coming with the authority of someone who is a professional and who chose you and is investing in you and has a lot of experience, and that's all great. You're basically getting a professional editor working with you, and they're paying you, and that is wonderful. The downside to that sometimes is that you feel a lot of pressure to accept their edits, even if you don't agree with them. And most editors will say, if you have a different way of working through this problem, I'm happy to talk about it. If you don't agree with anything, you don't just have to blindly follow these edits. We can discuss it. It's not like you just have to do everything they say, but it can be very intimidating to not do what they say. When I sold my first book, I hadn't written a lot of books prior to that. I was not experienced. I was still kind of a baby author. I'd just gotten to the point where my book was ready for publication, but I didn't have many books that I had worked through all these problems on. So it was kind of scary. I didn't always know when and how to push back or what I really wanted sometimes. And generally I worked very well with my editor at Bloomsbury. I don't have big regrets about anything. But it is a very different dynamic than hiring an editor yourself. And your main editor who acquires your book, they're going to do a developmental edit and also line edits. So first, they'll probably give you a multi-page, in my experience has always been multiple pages, developmental edit that will involve a total overhaul of your book. You're going to rewrite at least half the book entirely from scratch. And after you've done the developmental edit, and that could take a couple of rounds, then you're going to do a line edit with this editor. And generally they're just kind of now tweaking for more style and clarity. And then you're going to do an edit with a copy editor who's going to do more of the grammatical stuff, although they will also do a little bit of line editing where they might also suggest some little stylistic changes. But generally they're doing grammar and making sure things the timeline is correct and that things make sense. So that was my experience with editing with a traditional publishing house. Now, when I went into indie publishing, I'll be honest with you, I have never hired an editor at all. And you know. As far as developmental edits go, I haven't hired anyone because, like, when I started, I didn't have a lot of money, and I still have never really been able to justify the cost of a developmental editor. Very disheveled, just rolled out of bed editing Lydia here. You know, it's kind of the paradox of indie in a lot of ways that when you release your first indie book, most of the time, no one reads it. Like, you know, most debut indie author novels, I would guess, probably sell less than 50 copies, and that even that might be generous. So, you know, when you don't really know if you're doing the right thing yet, if you're attracting an audience at all, spending hundreds of dollars on an edit for like 20 people to read the book, you'll just kind of feel stupid. But there are, of course, readers justifiably complaining that they're reading indie books that aren't that good. But those are the ones that attracted readers in the first place, which is a small minority. So, you know, I don't know what's the best way to go around that problem, but that is kind of the facts of the situation. Because most of the books that I've written in indie publishing fall into one of two types. One, they're really written to market and they're written to tropes, and I'm following very like common story beats and common story elements, and I just don't feel like I need a developmental editor for that because the structure's already kind of there. Like a lot of romance novels just follow a very common sort of structure, and if you already have the experience of having 5 traditionally published books, I just don't feel it's worth the money to hire a developmental editor for a tropey book. And then when I got into publishing my Hidden Lands books, now that's the fantasy world I've been working on my whole life. I've been waiting my whole life to tell the story and publish it. So it's very personal. And in that case, I kind of just want to tell it the way that I've been dreaming of all these decades. Like, love it or hate it, this is the story, kind of. And this is where, you know, I might disagree with some people because I don't think that all indie authors do need a developmental editor for those precise 2 reasons. If you are writing a book that follows common structures in the genre, you might not need a developmental editor if you're a good writer. Now we'll circle back to that idea in a second. And if you're indie publishing because you have a story that's just very personal and you have a very specific vision for it, you may not want a developmental editor meddle with it if you're a good writer. So that's kind of the rub in indie publishing. If your writing is up to a decent standard, I don't think you necessarily need a developmental editor anymore. So that's kind of what the whole conversation hinges on to me. If your writing is up to a certain standard. The problem, of course, is that a lot of indie authors are not up to that standard yet, and they might not even know that they're not up to that standard. How do you know this if you've not been traditionally published? Like, I know because I have had multiple traditionally published book deals, so I can reasonably presume that my writing is up to a certain standard because I've had to go through the intense gauntlet of traditional publishing multiple times. But not everyone is going to want to try traditional publishing first, get published multiple times, and then go, okay, well now I've been validated. So how do you know that you're ready for publication? That is hard. My best advice is to start before you publish anything. Start with your friends who read your genre, and also people that are not your friends who read your genre, maybe in your critique group, or, you know, you could try publishing like fan fiction or serials. Basically, you want to get your work out there and see if you can get people to want to read it and to want to keep reading it. This is not necessarily a foolproof test, but like when I started out, the only people that really seemed excited about continuing to read my work were like my very best friends who were also writers, and they would send me their work and I was excited to read their work also because we knew each other so well and we spent so much time talking about our characters and our writing projects. Like, it became very personal. So we were able to enjoy each other's not that great work just because like it's like hanging out with your friend at that point. But I would kind of, somewhere in the back of my mind, notice that when I tried to get people outside of that immediate circle to read my book, I'd always get a response kind of like, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't gotten to it yet. Or, yeah, I read the first chapter, it was really good. I've been really busy. Or if I went to a critique group, I might get some compliments, but it wasn't just like a wow reaction. Like, you might even get people saying like, you're a good writer, it was good, but like, there's a difference between people telling you you're good and people being like, oh my God, I need the next chapter, or I stayed up all night reading your draft, or like, you're looking for people who react to your unpublished book the way you would want them to react to a published book. You don't just want you're a good writer, that first chapter was great. You want people that are like, oh my God, are you working on the sequel to this? If you never get that reaction from anyone except maybe your very bestest writer friend in the world, then you're probably good but not great. You might not be good enough yet. So the main point here is that, and honestly, this is even before, like, whether you hire an editor or not, you honestly want to try to get to this point. You want to have built these skills up on your own before you even spend money on an editor. Because the thing about editors, like in the course of this Audra Winter discourse, which if you're watching this video like far in the future, or if you haven't been following the Audra Winter thing, Audra Winter released a book recently that she managed to hype up really big, and then like she got a ton of pre-orders and a lot of excitement, and then when people read it they were very disappointed with the quality of the actual writing. And now, as I film this, she's talking on her TikTok about how she's hired a new editor and she's working with this editor and she's reworking the book so it will be up to a standard. But the thing is, editors, they're not like a magic wand. They don't just fix you can't just magically fix like any shitty book. An editor works best when a book is 95% of the way there already, or at least like 90%. Like, you want to be really close to good on your own before you hire an editor. Otherwise, because for one thing, if your book is really rough, one editing pass is not going to be enough. I rewrote Magic Under Glass from scratch twice before it even sold. So we're talking 3 completely new versions of the book before it even sold to an editor. And each draft was founded on getting intense critiques from people and taking those critiques into account and thinking about, why is this book not working and what can I do to improve it so that it works better and it's more compelling and it connects with people better. So after those 3 different versions, it finally gets an editor, it gets acquired, and then my editor asked me to completely rewrite it from scratch again. Well, that's probably an exaggeration. It probably wasn't the whole book from scratch. It was more like half the book from scratch, but the bottom line is it was a lot of major structural changes. So what if I had been hiring my editor on the first version of Magic Under Glass? What would she have said based on that first version of it? Chances are 1 pass would not have been enough, or if it had, the end product would have been just not great, because I hadn't really spent the time learning how to developmental edit myself until I had rewritten the book several times, and each time was based on like an intense focus on trying to learn to level up and like talking to my readers, my critique partners, and really wanting to know, what are you not connecting with? Where are you getting bored? What isn't working here? And then me going back to the drawing board, trying to think through my own solutions as to what could make this story more compelling, more sympathy with the main character. It makes sense more, it's not confusing. There were just so many different elements that I had to learn how to balance. And if you haven't really learned to grasp the fundamentals of a developmental edit, like what you're really trying to do and why, then the feedback from your editor, it might not hit the way that it's supposed to. You might not really understand quite what to do with the feedback, how to make the changes, why you're making the changes. These are not always easy things to learn. They don't always just happen immediately. They can take years of work. I'm going to say that like 75% of the unpublished manuscripts I've read throughout my entire life probably weren't even ready for that, like to just have one edit and then be ready to publish. Now, on the flip side, sometimes the author has kind of a unique vision, and editors are trained in like the craft of writing and what works, at least, you know, they should be. And they usually have a lot of experience with like storytelling and like the just fundamental psychology of why people want to read on in a book. Like, there's a lot of general rules that would just apply to any book. When I give editorial feedback to somebody, I always try to break it into two categories. One is the like, this is just a basic rule of writing that you're not following here, and I really, really strongly suggest that you take this suggestion. And then there's the suggestions where I'm like, this might just be me. I'm not sure. This part, it confused me, or it's not connecting with me, but I'm not sure I'm right about it. And I think that most good editors do understand that idea, that they are bringing both their broad knowledge and their personal taste to the table when they're editing a book. But nevertheless, editors are just individuals, and they are going to have their own personal taste and their own individual ideas as to how to improve a book that might not always connect with yours. So hiring an editor is not always a magic bullet to making the book the best it can be. Sometimes you just don't really connect with your editor as much as you would hoped. And I've talked about it before, but that kind of happened to me with my first editor at Disney Hyperion. Her editorial suggestions, they made sense. I didn't really have an issue with them, like objectively, but the end result of following them, like often I just didn't quite feel right about the suggestion she had made as far as like what my vision was for the book. But I would struggle sometimes with like, what would the alternative be? And I think this is actually fairly common in traditional publishing, that I've seen some of my other friends, I've read their like unsold, unpublished draft, and then they sold the book, and they worked with their editor, they rewrote the book, and then I read the final book, and I would kind of sometimes be like, I kind of like the original draft better. And that's kind of how I felt about Dark Metropolis. Like, I still kind of like my original better, even though I totally 100% understand where she was coming from with most of her suggestions, and like when she would point out parts that weren't working and I look at the original draft, I'm like, she was right about that on paper, but somehow I was not quite able, like I was not quite able to retain the thing I loved about the book, the like heart or the atmosphere. Something was lost in the translation that I just was not able to retain when I did the rewrite. And that is a problem sometimes with editing. And when you are writing a book that's a little more unique and doesn't follow as much of a specific structure, sometimes you just don't yet have the skill to bring it up to snuff. This is something that I very much encountered with the Alfred story, which I've recently published as The Potion Dealers. And I really feel good about The Potion Dealers. It's like the first version of the story that I don't have a feeling like something was off. It's not quite right. I have written this book, I've published this book previously in two different incarnations, once as a young adult fantasy in 2016, and then as a urban adult fantasy, or like urban fantasy, in 2017. And I was trying to like make it work in like a genre mold, and it just didn't work. But beyond that, I really was not skilled enough as a writer to tell the story yet. When I look back at those old versions, I can just see the weaknesses in the storytelling that I was just still, despite having traditionally published 5 books, I had the skill level at that point to write something simple and tropey and release it and have it do well, but I had not yet learned how to execute a more complicated and unusual project yet. So what am I trying to say here? Am I trying to tell you that you should not hire an editor for your indie published book? Well, no. The vast majority of indie books could use an editor or have benefited from having one, but what I did just want to talk about is that it's more complicated than a black and white answer. Some authors have enough skill to not need a developmental editor, and some authors don't yet have enough skill to truly benefit from a developmental editor. And ditto with a line editor. Like, indie authors who can't afford a editor all magically getting like free access to one, it would not solve the problem of like terrible indie books, because a lot of authors just aren't at the point where they're ready to write a publishable book, whether they have an editor or not. This is not necessarily an easy skill. Books come in wildly different levels of complication as well, and that's another reason I think you can't just boil this down to a simple question. My fairy tale retellings were very much simple books based on the template of a fairy tale, and I don't think that that needs as much work as, let's say, if you're writing some crazy offbeat epic fantasy that's going to sprawl across 5 books. Those are wildly different entities. So you might have more authors able to pull off like simple and tropey without an editor than really complicated. But then you also have the authors that have a very unique vision that an editor might not necessarily be able to figure out how to best fulfill that vision. Sometimes only the author can really figure that out through trial and error. So yeah, it's complicated. But the original question, I believe, was just simply, what do you do if you can't afford an editor? Does that mean you don't even deserve to publish if you're kind of a beginner? Or do you just have to wait until you can save up the money for an editor? Well, my best advice for this really is to spend as much time as possible trying to get critique partners. And when I say critique partners, I mean partners. I don't mean readers. I mean people that you're going to trade manuscripts with, because one of the most important things you can do is to critique other people's work as much as possible. It will help fix your blind spots about your own work, because you'll have to spend so much time analyzing why a book doesn't work. You'll start to internalize that, and you'll start to see the problems with your own work the more that you do it. You'll develop an editor brain of your own. So yes, do a lot of critique exchanges. And not all the critiques you get will be good, and you don't have to listen to all of them. But just by doing a lot of critiquing yourself, you will get better, and you'll start to get a broad picture of like, what are all your critique partners saying are a weakness, or like, is anybody getting really excited to read this book, or are they all just kind of doing it more like begrudgingly as a favor because you're reading their book? And after you've kind of gotten to a point where you're starting to feel fairly confident about your work, but maybe you still don't have money, I would say that if you hire an editor just to edit the first chunk of your book, like the first 50 pages, a lot of the problems in any book will be revealed in the first 50 pages. In fact, I would say if you've never paid for an edit before and you've never published and had like a successful release before, I would start with that just right off the bat. I would just only pay for an edit of the first 50 pages, because in my experience, once I get an edit of the first 50 pages, like back when I was kind of a newbie, I would already be realizing like, okay, wait a minute, I have an idea for the rest now. Something needs to change. You're totally right. This isn't even working in chapter 3, and the only way I can fix this is if I rewrite the whole damn book. So just paying for an edit of like the first 50 or even like 30 pages if you don't have a lot of money can really tell you a lot about what your weaknesses are. And I would also say, really, I think that everyone should invest in a professional line and copy edit at least once in their lives if you've never been traditionally published, because just working with line and copy editors several times, it helped me to catch a lot of like my tics as an author. We all kind of have certain things that we like make the same mistake over and over and over and over. And if you pay for a line and copy edit just once or twice, you're going to develop a much better sense of how to edit your own work in the future, even if you can't afford that for every book. So if I was publishing my first book straight to indie publishing and I was on a small budget, I would pay for a developmental broad picture edit of the first 50 pages. I would rewrite the entire book based on that feedback, assuming that that was reflective of the feedback I received. And if I felt pretty good about that part of it, then I would just pay for a line edit. Now, obviously, if you're not in a budget and you have financial resources to invest in your writing, I fully support hiring a developmental editor for the entire book and maybe a separate line and copy editor, especially if you're new. I do think that authors owe it to readers to deliver the best book they possibly can, but I also want to acknowledge that sometimes the only way to know what the best book looks like is just to get it out there, see what the reaction is, and let yourself improve over time. Editors are not this magic bullet. If Audra Winter's book, I haven't read it and I don't want to pile on with her anymore, but if Audra Winter's book is as bad as people are saying, then I'm not sure that one round of edits is going to fix it. She might need to just work on her craft for 3 more years. That's true of many authors, that sometimes a developmental editor cannot fix a rotten foundation. They work best when you have good bones already. And meanwhile, some authors have really put in the work and have a lot of talent and as well as skill and time put into the craft and can write good books without developmental editing, particularly if the first books that they're aiming for are not extremely ambitious and perhaps follow kind of a common plot structure. So yeah, those are my thoughts on editing. I would love to know your thoughts on this topic. I am often asked for tips on how to hire a good developmental editor, and I don't know because I've never hired one. I've only worked with editors that chose my book on submission, and then I've just done everything else on my own and with feedback from Dade as I read my books to him and maybe friends along the way. So if you've hired a developmental editor, I'd love to know, how did you approach that process? Give some tips in the comments. And also, if you have any recommendations for how you're finding critique partners these days, that is another question I get a lot, and I don't know how people are finding critique partners at the moment. So share your knowledge, please. While I was working on this video, I actually had one of my members ask me if I would do a video about working with editors, and she asked me from somewhat of a different angle than what this video was. So I'm actually planning another video on working with editors that has a bit of a different angle, but if you have any thoughts or questions about working with editors or doing edits, I would love to hear them because I might incorporate them into this next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to stick around, I publish videos on the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. I have a Patreon and a Substack. They both have the same content with a free tier, and if you'd like 2 bonus videos from me every month and access to my Discord server, you can join either of those or my YouTube memberships. If you'd like to read any of my books that really help support the channel, there's a link in the description, and I have a new release this month called Wanted: Brooding Man, Tragic Past, a cozy fantasy about Una, a girl who reads too many gothic novels and thinks that her dream man is brooding with a tragic past, but he actually might just be the cinnamon roll goth boy that she's known forever, but who has gone missing in the recent war that ended, but he didn't come back. And maybe she's the only one who can find him. It has good spooky season vibes, I think. If you'd like to catch my lives, I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. and often on Wednesdays at 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!